The mail arrived at 4 in the afternoon, the same time it always did, and Marion Cole almost didn't open the envelope with no return address. She almost tossed it into the wood stove with the bills and the coupon flyers. But something about the handwriting stopped her. It was too neat, too careful, like it had been practiced. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it, in that same careful hand, was a sentence that would keep her awake for the next 30 nights. I know what you did to your sister in the summer of 1987. I am not the only one who knows. Wait for the next letter. That was how it started in Hollow Creek, Kentucky, a town of 900 people where everybody waved at everybody and nobody, until that autumn, had a single secret they thought anyone else could see. By the time the leaves turned that October, 17 people in Hollow Creek had received a letter. Each one was different. Each one was true. And each one ended the same way, with 4 words that would come to haunt the whole town like a slow-moving fog rolling off the ridge. Wait for the next letter. Hollow Creek sat in a valley between 2 low mountains, the kind of place where the church bell could be heard from every porch, and the diner on Main Street served the same meatloaf special every Thursday for as long as anyone could remember. It was the kind of town people meant when they used the word idyllic, the kind of place city folks romanticized in magazines about slowing down and getting back to what mattered. But every town has a cellar, and in Hollow Creek, the cellar was about to be unlocked. Marion Cole was 61 years old, a retired schoolteacher who lived alone in the house her parents had built, a widow for 11 years, a woman who kept her flower beds immaculate and her past buried even deeper. She had told exactly one person about the summer of 1987, and that person had died 9 years ago. So when the letter arrived, her hands began to shake before her mind even caught up to what she was reading. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with the letter in front of her, staring at it like it might rearrange itself into something less terrifying if she looked hard enough. In the morning, she drove to the sheriff's office, letter in hand, expecting to be the only one. She was not the only one. Sheriff Daniel Reyes was 44, a man who had left Hollow Creek at 18 for the Army and come back at 31 because his father was dying and someone needed to run the family's small cattle operation. He'd taken the sheriff job almost by accident, the way small towns sometimes hand responsibility to whoever happens to be standing nearby with a steady head. He had a wife, 2 daughters, and a reputation for being fair, which in a town like Hollow Creek was worth more than being smart. When Marion set the letter on his desk, he read it twice, his jaw tightening the second time through. Then he opened his desk drawer and pulled out 3 more letters, each one sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve, each one delivered in the last 4 days. "You're the 4th," he said quietly, "that I know of." By the end of that week, the number had climbed to 11. By the following week, 17. The letters were not random accusations. They were specific, detailed, correct in ways that made denial impossible. A deacon at the Baptist church had once, 20 years earlier, embezzled money meant for a mission trip and quietly paid it back before anyone noticed, or so he'd believed. A woman who ran the flower shop had left a hit-and-run scene in 1994, a dented mailbox and a shattered porch light she'd never reported, small enough that she'd convinced herself it didn't count. The high school football coach had once let a star player cheat his way through a drug test so the team could win state, a decision that had eaten at him quietly for 2 decades. Marion's sister, it turned out, hadn't drowned by accident in the summer of 1987. Marion had let her go under, just for a moment, just long enough. And then she'd pulled her out and performed CPR and cried real tears at the funeral. And she had told herself for 37 years that the moment of letting go had never happened at all. That memory was a trick of grief, that she had imagined the stillness of her own hands. The letters did not accuse people of crimes society would universally condemn. They were worse than that, in a way. They were the private failures, the moments of weakness, the decisions made in half a second that a person spends the rest of their life trying to forget. The stranger, whoever they were, hadn't just learned facts. They had reached into the most guarded rooms of 17 different minds and found the one door nobody else had ever opened. Reyes assigned his 2 deputies to trace the letters. Same paper, generic and available at any office supply store within 100 miles. Same ink, ordinary ballpoint. No fingerprints beyond the recipient's own. No postmark from Hollow Creek itself. The letters had been mailed from 3 different post offices in 3 different counties, each one at least 40 minutes away, which meant either the sender was deliberately covering distance or there was more than one sender. That thought, once it entered the town's collective mind, spread faster than the letters themselves. What if it wasn't one person? What if it was several working together? What if it was everyone and nobody? Hollow Creek began to change in ways that were subtle at first, and then impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had shared coffee every morning for a decade started finding reasons to avoid each other. The diner, once loud with the overlapping chatter of regulars, grew quiet, filled with people eating fast and watching the door. At church, the pews that used to fill front to back began emptying from the front, people drifting to the rear rows, closer to the exits, as if faith itself needed an escape route now. Marian tried to keep teaching her Sunday school class, tried to keep her hands from trembling when she poured coffee for visitors, tried to convince herself that the letter was a cruel prank, a coincidence, anything but the truth arriving 37 years late to collect what it was owed. But at night, she dreamed of green water and small cold fingers slipping from her grip, and she woke gasping, certain someone was standing at the foot of her bed. The second letter came 12 days after the first. It was shorter. You told yourself it was an accident. We both know better. I am not interested in punishing you. I am interested in whether you can finally tell the truth. You have until the leaves are gone. Ray's read that one standing in Marian's kitchen, and for the first time, he understood that this wasn't blackmail in any ordinary sense. Nobody had asked for money. Nobody had threatened exposure to the police, not directly, not yet. The letters seemed to want something stranger and harder to defend against. They wanted confession. He drove home that night past the Hendricks place, an old Victorian house on the edge of town that had sat mostly empty for 6 years, ever since old Walter Hendricks had died, and left it to a nephew nobody in Hollow Creek had ever met. The porch light was on. Rays slowed the truck without meaning to, some old instinct from 20 years of policing prickling at the back of his neck, and then he told himself he was being paranoid and drove on. He would think about that porch light many times over the following weeks. The town tried to solve it themselves before the sheriff's department made any real progress, because that is what small towns do. Theories multiplied like weeds after rain. Some said it was Ruth Ann Baylor's estranged son, come back to get revenge on the community that had shunned his mother after her divorce. Some said it was a disgruntled former resident, someone Hollow Creek had wronged, and who was now wronging it back in slow motion. Someone even suggested it might be a true crime podcaster building material for a series, which would have been almost funny if the letters hadn't been so devastatingly, intimately accurate. Then, on a gray Tuesday in early November, the 18th letter arrived, and it was addressed not to a resident of Hollow Creek, but to the sheriff himself. Daniel, you have spent 4 years pretending you did not know your father was drinking again before he died behind the wheel that night. You told the coroner it was a medical event. You know it was not. I am not writing to hurt you. I am writing because this town has spent generations mistaking silence for peace. I want to see what happens when the silence breaks. Rays sat with that letter for a long time in his truck outside the office, the engine off, his hands resting on the wheel like he'd forgotten what they were for. His father's accident, the single-vehicle wreck on Route 9, the small bottle of whiskey found in the wreckage that Rays himself had quietly removed from the scene report before anyone official arrived. Nobody knew that. Not his wife. Not his daughters. Not a living soul, or so he had believed for 4 years. He understood, sitting in that truck, that whoever was writing these letters was not guessing. They were not fishing with vague accusations hoping something would stick. They knew. Precisely, intimately, impossibly, they knew. The investigation deepened. Rays brought in a state police detective, a sharp, quiet woman named Detective Alvarez who had worked cases in 3 counties and had a reputation for patience that bordered on stubbornness. She read through all 18 letters twice before she said a word. Then she laid them out on the conference table in chronological order and studied them the way a person studies a photograph looking for a face they almost recognize. These aren't confessions extracted from research, she said finally. Research finds facts. Court records, old newspapers, gossip. This is different. This is intimate. Whoever wrote these knows what these people feel guilty about, not just what they did. That's not investigation. That's closeness. You're saying it's someone in town, Reyes said. I'm saying it's someone who has spent a very long time listening. Really listening. The kind of listening most people don't do, because most people are too busy waiting for their turn to talk. Alvarez began interviewing the 17, now 18, letter recipients individually, looking for a common thread. It took her 4 days to find it, and when she did, it was so simple that everyone in that conference room felt a little sick for not seeing it sooner. Every single recipient, at some point over the past 6 years, had spent time alone with the same person. Father Michael Doss. He had come to Hollow Creek 6 years earlier, a quiet, soft-spoken priest in his early 50s, assigned to St. Agatha's after the previous pastor retired. He was well-liked, unremarkable in the way that good priests often are, present at every funeral, every hospital bedside, every late-night crisis call. He ran a grief support group on Tuesday evenings that had, over the years, quietly absorbed half the town's private sorrows. He heard confession every Saturday afternoon in the small wooden booth at the back of St. Agatha's, the same booth that had stood in that spot for over a century. Marion Cole had gone to him 11 years earlier, in the raw months after her husband's death, and in a moment of exhausted grief, she had told him about the summer of 1987. She had never told anyone else, not even her husband. She had believed, the way Catholics are taught to believe, that the confessional was a sealed room, that what was said inside it disappeared into something sacred and untouchable. Reyes's mother, dying of cancer 4 years ago, had confessed something to Father Doss on her deathbed, something about her son and the night his father died, a detail she had pieced together from things Daniel had said in his grief and never meant to reveal but had, in the exhausted honesty of watching a parent die. She had asked the priest to carry that burden so her son wouldn't have to carry it alone. She had believed it would die with her. One by one, as Alvarez and Reyes worked through the list, the pattern held. Every secret in every letter had, at some point, passed through the confessional at St. Agatha's, or through a private counseling session with Father Doss, or through the grief group where people, worn down by loss, said things in the dark of a church basement that they would never say in daylight. The seal of the confessional, the one thing in Hollow Creek that everyone had trusted absolutely, more than the sheriff, more than the bank, more than each other. A promise older than the town itself, and it had been the door through which the stranger walked into every single locked room. They brought Father Doss in for questioning on a cold Thursday morning, and he came without protest, without a lawyer, sitting in the small interview room at the sheriff's office with his hands folded in his lap, looking, Reyes would say later, almost relieved. "You know why you're here," Reyes said. "I do," Father Doss answered. His voice was steady, gentle, the same voice he used at the pulpit. "I have been waiting for this conversation for a long time, Sheriff, longer than you'd believe." Detective Alvarez leaned forward. "Did you write these letters?" "I wrote every one," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no shame, only a strange, tired clarity. The room went silent. Reyes felt something cold settle in his chest, the confirmation of a fear he'd been carrying for weeks now finally given a face and a voice. "Why?" Alvarez asked, not a demand, a genuine question. Father Doss looked down at his folded hands for a long moment before he answered. 6 years ago, I came to this town from a parish in Ohio," he said. "I came because I was running from something myself, though it took me years to admit that even to myself. I sat in that booth every Saturday and I listened to this town confess its sins, one soul at a time, and I gave absolution, and I meant it every time. I believed in the sacrament with my whole heart." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "But something started happening to me. I began to see this town differently than the people living in it saw themselves. I watched Marion Cole teach Sunday school to children with a gentleness that broke my heart, knowing what she carried. I watched Daniel here wear his badge with such conviction, knowing what he'd hidden to protect his father's memory. I watched a whole town smile at each other on Main Street, wave from their porches, share casseroles at funerals, all while carrying these terrible private weights they believed no one else could see. And I began to understand something that I don't think any of you understand yet. Which is what? Ray said, his voice low. That the secrets were never the sickness, Father Doss said. The silence was. Every single person who confessed to me walked out of that booth believing they were alone in their guilt, believing that if anyone truly knew what they'd done, they would be cast out, unloved, unforgivable. And so they spent years, decades, performing a kind of goodness that had a hole in the center of it, a hole shaped exactly like the thing they were hiding. I watched this town suffocate slowly under the weight of everyone's separate, private shame, each person convinced their darkness was uniquely damning, when in truth, nearly everyone around them was carrying something just as heavy. Alvarez's voice was careful. So you decided to expose them? No, Father Doss said, and for the first time his composure cracked slightly, something almost desperate showing through. I decided to free them. I have watched what secrecy does to a human soul for 30 years in this collar. It rots people from the inside while they smile on the outside. I thought, if I could bring these things into the light, not to destroy anyone, but to force a reckoning, this town might finally understand that everyone is carrying something. That nobody is as alone in their guilt as they believe. That confession, real confession, spoken out loud to another human being, not whispered into a dark box, might actually heal something the secrecy never could. You broke the seal of the confessional, Reyes said. You do understand that's not a small thing. That's the one promise this whole town believed was unbreakable. I understand it better than anyone, Father Doss said, and his eyes were wet now, his hands trembling slightly where they rested on the table. I have violated the deepest trust of my vocation. I will answer for that before God and before the church and before every person in this town, and I do not expect forgiveness for it. But I ask you to consider something, Sheriff. Every letter I wrote ended the same way. Wait for the next letter. Not, I will destroy you. Not, pay me or I will tell everyone. I gave every single person time. Time to decide whether they would tell their own truth before I forced it into the light for them. I wanted them to choose honesty, not have it stolen from them. That was the only mercy I had left to offer. The room was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees along Main Street, and somewhere a church bell rang the hour, the same bell that had rung over Hollow Creek for 140 years, indifferent to the storm breaking beneath it. Father Doss was arrested that afternoon, charged with harassment and criminal coercion, though the legal reality of what he'd done was murkier than anyone wanted to admit. He had broken no law by knowing secrets. Confession was not a legally protected privilege in every context, and the letters, while cruel in their method, contained no explicit threats. Alvarez spent weeks untangling exactly what could be charged and what couldn't, and in the end, the district attorney settled on a handful of lesser charges that would keep Father Doss in the county jail for a matter of months rather than years. The diocese removed him from ministry immediately and permanently. St. Agatha's would need a new priest, and the confessional booth at the back of the church, the small wooden box that had held a century and a half of Hollow Creek's whispered sins, was quietly dismantled and burned that winter, at the request of the congregation itself, as though the wood had been contaminated by what it once contained. But something else happened in Hollow Creek that fall, something Father Doss could never have predicted with any certainty, though it seemed, in the weeks that followed, that some deep and reckless part of him had hoped for it anyway. Marion Cole stood up at a town meeting in late November, called originally to discuss what to do about the vacancy at St. Agatha's, and instead, in front of nearly 200 of her neighbors, she told them what had happened in the summer of 1987. Her voice shook. She gripped the podium so hard her knuckles went white. She said the words she had never said out loud in 37 years, that for one terrible moment she had let her sister go under the water, that she had lived every day since with that moment locked inside her like a stone in her chest, that she did not know if she deserved forgiveness, but that she was tired, so tired, of carrying it alone. Nobody in that room stood up and condemned her. A woman, too, rose back. A woman Marion barely knew, began to cry. Another stood and said quietly that she too had done something once, something she had never told a living soul, and that hearing Marion speak had made her feel, for the first time in 15 years, that she was not a monster wearing a normal woman's face. It did not happen all at once, and it was not universal. Some of the 18 never spoke publicly at all, chose instead to quietly leave Hollow Creek in the months that followed, unable to remain in a town that had glimpsed their hidden selves even briefly. The football coach resigned and moved to Ohio. The flower shop owner sold her business within the year. Not every wound Father Doss had opened closed clean, and some, Reyes understood, might never close at all. He would carry his own guilt about what he'd hidden about his father for the rest of his life, and telling his wife the truth, which he finally did on a January evening with the fire burning low and his daughters asleep upstairs, did not erase what he'd done. It only meant he no longer carried it entirely alone, which was, he came to understand, a different kind of weight, lighter in ways he hadn't expected and heavier in others. But something in the town's air did change. People began, slowly, cautiously, to talk to each other differently. Not with the performative cheerfulness of before, the waves and the casseroles that had papered over so much unspoken pain, but with something rawer and more honest. The grief group that Father Doss had once run continued under new leadership. A retired counselor named Estelle Ford, who had lived in Hollow Creek for 30 years, and had, as it turned out, never once been contacted by the stranger's letters, because she had never confessed anything to anyone. She began the group's first meeting under her leadership by telling them, unprompted, about a mistake of her own from decades earlier, a small cruelty toward a sister long since passed, and the room exhaled together, as though her honesty had given them all permission to breathe. Reyes visited Father Doss once in the county jail, near the end of that first winter, sitting across from him through the scratched plexiglass, neither man saying much for a long while. "I don't forgive you," Reyes said finally. "I want you to know that. What you did to this town, what you did to me, it wasn't your right to take. That trust belonged to us, not to you." "I know," Father Doss said quietly. "I have never asked to be forgiven for the method, only understood, perhaps, for the reason behind it, though I recognize those are not the same thing, and one does not excuse the other." "Was it worth it?" Reyes asked. "Watching what happened to this town, watching people's lives fall apart, was it worth whatever you thought you were accomplishing?" Father Doss was quiet for a long time before he answered, and when he did, his voice had none of the certainty it once carried from the pulpit. "I don't know," he said. "I believed I was tearing down a wall that was slowly killing the people behind it. I still believe that wall was killing them. But I have thought every day, every single day since my arrest, about whether there was a gentler way to do what I did, a way that did not require me to become the very kind of betrayer I once stood in judgment of. I don't have an answer for you, Sheriff. I only have the town as it is now, changed in ways I cannot undo, for better and for worse both, and I will spend whatever years I have left trying to understand which one weighs heavier in the end." Reyes left the jail that day without another word, and he did not visit again. Hollow Creek moved forward, as towns do, the way rivers move around stones too heavy to carry away. The following spring, a new priest arrived at St. Agatha's, a young man named Father Elias Ward who chose, deliberately, to hold confession in an open-side chapel rather than a sealed booth, facing his parishioners rather than hiding behind a screen, an arrangement some found strange and others found, quietly, like the first honest breath the church had taken in years. Marion Cole kept teaching Sunday school. She was different now, the neighbors said, softer somehow, though nobody could quite explain what they meant by that. She visited her sister's grave every week instead of once a year, and she talked to the headstone sometimes, out loud, the way a person talks to someone they finally believe can hear them. The letters never came again. Whatever the stranger had needed to say, he had said it, all 18 times, in ink on ordinary paper mailed from 3 different counties, and Hollow Creek would spend years deciding what to make of what he'd done, whether he was a monster who had shattered something sacred or a broken man who had, in his own devastating way, tried to save a town from itself by burning down the one thing everyone had trusted to keep them safe. Perhaps, in the end, he had been both, Perhaps every stranger who ever truly knows us is. And on quiet evenings, when the church bell rang over the valley and the porch lights came on one by one along Main Street, the people of Hollow Creek would sometimes look at each other a little longer than they used to, wondering, in the private rooms of their own hearts, what secrets still waited behind familiar faces, and whether, someday, someone might finally have the courage to let them out into the light on their own.